I appreciate, obviously I appreciate you coming, even though I know it was mandatory. We have an esteemed author here, someone who's been a friend of mine for 10 years, and who's written a book that has been widely acclaimed all over the country. And so I want to talk about his bio just a little bit, give you a brief introduction as to who he is, and then we'll get started. One of the things I wanted to say is I want to create a space where you feel comfortable, if you can in this forum, kind of raising your hand so we can kind of call on you. It's a dialogue between all of us, even though we're the ones up here. We may have conversations that may feel uncomfortable at times, that may challenge us to kind of think outside the box a little bit. And so, feel free to disagree, feel free to speak your mind if you feel safe to do so. Hopefully you do. When we created these KO conversations, we wanted to be thoughtful about bringing real issues that are happening in our world, what's going on outside of the KO walls and doors, and be able to bring that conversation to you, because I know those conversations are already happening, sometimes United Students, sometimes on social media. And so to be in a space where we can discuss as a community, I think is extremely important. So let me start. Brendan Kiely received his Master's in Fine Arts and Creative Writing from the City College of New York. His debut novel, The Gospel of Winter, has been published in 10 languages. It was selected as one of American Library Association's top 10 best fiction for young adults in 2015. And it was a Kirkus Review selection for best of 2014. He's the co-author with Jason Reynolds of the Coretta Scott King Author Honor Award-winning All-American Boys, which is the novel that we'll be discussing and kind of our jumping off point for today. And this past Sunday has been added to the New York Times bestseller list. He's also the author of the newly released The Last True Love Story. Brendan worked for 10 years at the Calhoun School in New York City as a high school English teacher. Originally from the Boston area, he now lives with his wife in Greenwich Village, which is also one of my best friends. Let's start with All American Boys. Can you, for folks who haven't read it, can you give a little bit of a synopsis?
Sure.
As to what it's about?
So first of all, thanks so much for inviting me.
Absolutely.
And this is so great to speak with all of you, so thank you for listening. Yes, All American Boys is a novel about two boys, one black, one white, both of whom go to the same school, live in the same town, and have vastly different experiences. Jason and I wanted to take as our jumping off point for this book the famous line from a speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave at Grosse Pointe High School in 1968, where he spoke about two Americas living side by side. And we wanted to talk about how relevant that felt as we were in 2014 watching one news story after another about police violence, and in particular, the victims of this police violence more often than not being folks of color, and often young folks of color. And so we wanted to write a novel that sort of spoke about that relevancy today. And so All American Boys begins with, it's told in dueling narratives. So there's Rashad Butler, written by Jason Reynolds, and Quinn Collins, written by yours truly. And we alternate chapters, the jumping off point being a violent incident at a corner store with a misunderstanding and a police officer brutalizing Rashad. And so these two boys have to figure out what their roles will be in society for the rest of the novel. And it basically details 1 week at the school where these two boys are trying to figure out, who they're going to be after that moment.
Right. So, when you kind of take on a contentious subject like racial profiling, and I know that you travel to different schools with very different populations, some probably nearly all black schools, and then also wealthy suburban schools, and also in different regions. Yeah. But given the national narrative on racially charged police incidents, et cetera, unfolding over the last couple of years, and quite frankly earlier, how has this book been received in these different areas by these populations, et cetera?
So Jason and I have spoken to over 35,000 students across the country. We have spoken in incredibly wealthy schools like the Taft School here in Connecticut, We have spoken at alternative high schools that are sort of, for lack of a better phrase, kind of last stop for folks who are, still trying to graduate from high school. We've spoken in outside of St. Louis, right next to Ferguson, Missouri. We next week we'll be speaking all week in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Point is, all over the place. Right. And there have been a different kind of reception in different places. So while we've been invited to many places, we've also been disinvited. We've also been told not to speak about this book. We've been told that we should not be, in fact, talking publicly about this subject, for fear that what it will do is it will incite a anti-police sentiment in the community, which is definitely not our goal, and nor is it what the book is about, because the book is not an anti-police novel at all. The problem is when people say we're going to have a book that's about racially charged violence by police officers, it sounds like it might be anti-police, but it's not anti-police. In fact, when I was a teacher, I use this analogy, when I was a teacher at Calhoun, I welcomed comments from students and from other teachers and from parents, because I wanted to know how to do my job better, because my goal was to serve the young folks that were in my classroom every day. I think it's likewise the case that law enforcement can hear criticism to do a better job doing what they're supposed to do, which is to protect and serve the communities they serve.
But what's interesting about that, if I were to challenge that a little bit, is that, the rhetoric still seems to be anti-police,
right?
At least from the perspective.
Right.
And so how, in the book, there's a town that's divided, right? It reaches the national media, social media takes off, there's a town that's divided. How do we have this conversation in a way that, how do we really hammer the point home that this is not anti-police, we're really looking at police brutality, and then how do we bring people together to have discourse in a way that's not vitriolic? You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think it's important. I think it's really important that we do a better job learning to listen. Mm-hmm. When I watch news media, I feel like I see point counterpoint, and nobody's actually having a conversation. They're just shouting their points back and forth.
That's all news media. That's not just
yeah. No, of course. I could be watching NBC. I could be watching Fox News. The point is that the setup for that kind of point counterpoint is not a listening environment. It's a shouting of points. And I believe that we can do a better job learning to listen. And that, for me, means when we're having these conversations about law enforcement and about community and about young folks, I think that everybody who can be involved in that conversation could take a step back and listen. I would like to go one step further, if I may.
Sure.
Because it's impossible for me to have a conversation about this book or about police violence without also talking about racism, because I think it's fundamental to the problem. And so if we are talking about racism in America, I want to be very clear with all of you that as a white person entering the conversation about race and racism in America, my first priority is to listen. Yeah. And wherever we go, I like to remind people that I think it is key. It is key. If we are going to have a conversation about, a real conversation about law enforcement, about racism, white folks have to listen to the truth coming from communities of color. It is our fundamental first step that we must do. And it often sounds like a strange, radical thing for me to say, which it worries me, because I feel like we're not having a conversation if we white folks are not first off listening. Instead of saying, but this is an exception, but this is an exception, you're already forming the counter-narrative in your mind. You're not listening. So my key is, I think that we've got to learn how to listen.
So how do you reconcile this idea of, what was your journey? Because this perspective is a perspective that not everyone shares, right? It's a perspective that when people talk about racism, some folks think racism is over, quite frankly. Right. And that things that have happened in the past, or slavery in terms of the United States in its history, there's really what are the ramifications that are happening now? How are those things related? So I've had conversations with folks here in the audience where there's a disconnect there between what you're saying is we have to listen. Like, why can't we all be in dialogue at the same time? And you talk about this counter narrative, but why can't we?
Yeah.
Why can't I point out the exceptions, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So I feel like the narrative that supports me, that makes me feel comfortable, I see all the time.
Okay.
And what I mean is, when I watch the news, I watch over and over again a narrative that says this is why this moment of police violence is an exception. And it makes me feel better because I can say, see, I told you law enforcement works okay. That's not me listening, that's me being reinforced with a particular point of view. I would also like to maybe share a little story about how I get here.
Okay.
Yeah, the question was about how I get here.
Absolutely.
And I'll share, first of all, how many folks in the audience drive? Whoa, all right. Awesome. I forgot I was speaking with mostly juniors and seniors. All right. So I grew up in the Boston area. I'm going to quickly tell you a story about a moment in time that gets me to where I am to write this book. Okay. I am 17 years old and I am driving. The story I'm about to tell you is not a story, I'm not bragging, I'm not proud of the story. It is, I just have to share it in order to give you some context, right? So, 17 years old, and I'm driving a minivan, which is not so mini, it's enormous, but it's a few years back because I'm, old and broken. So I'm driving a minivan full of white boys like me. And I'm driving down Route 1, you know Route 1. I'm driving down Route 1 south. I'm going 85 miles an hour in a 55-mile zone. It's dumb. It's dangerous, right? And most importantly for this story, it's illegal. All right? I'm driving 85 in a 55. It's not just speeding, for those of you who drive, because you all know this, I'm sure. It's also reckless driving. So I'm breaking the law in two ways. What happens? Police car comes up behind me, lights, sirens. It's the first time that's ever happened to me. What do? I'm nervous, I'm scared. I floor it. I keep going. My friends are like, Brendan, pull over. I don't know where to pull over. I don't know where it's safe. I'm flooring it down the highway being chased by a police officer. Finally, up ahead of me, I see a parking lot for a restaurant. Okay? I pull into the parking lot. I take my time pulling into a parking space. The police officer comes up, knocks on the window, asks for license and registration. I eventually am able to give it to him. He goes back to the car, comes back, tells me to step out of the car. I step out of the car. Have you been drinking tonight? No, I have not. Smoking marijuana? No, I have not. Why are you going 30 miles over the speed limit then? And I go into a sob story. Oh, Mr. Officer, we were trying to play mini golf and it just wasn't working out, and then we're supposed to go get ice cream and everyone's yelling in the back of the car and I just want to go home. I just want to go home. All this nonsense, right? The problem with this story is what happens next. Because depending on where we are, when Jason and I are talking about this stuff, and if he and I are sharing stories like this, right, people begin to assume what happens next. Because here's the trick, right? Did I get a ticket? No. Right. No, I did not get a ticket. What? Did I get a written warning? No, not at all. I believe, looking in hindsight, with as much way that I can look back on this as possible, I believe that this police officer took pity on me because it looked like I was probably going to cause a little puddle between my feet in like half a second, right? I'm sure that's true. I also think it's very true to think about what it means to have white privilege and what it means in the context of our bigger system, right? So when we're talking about listening to a narrative, right? People can say, oh, Brendan, but you're giving that police officer a hard time for no reason. What if he really was just feeling bad for you? Yes, that might be true. And as I hear other stories all too often from folks of color, when I taught at this school in New York, right? And there's a policy called stop and frisk, where students would come to me in the morning, having just arrived to school, and talk about how police officers had stopped them on the way to school and checked their bags, right? These were not the white students. Every single time it was a student of color. So I put this in a larger context. My not getting a ticket, and then I'm going to give you the real punchline, which is the part that sticks with me the most. My not getting a ticket is not just my story, it's my story within the bigger picture.
Right.
Because what the police officer said to me, and will always sit with me, is go home, be safe, and keep your friends safe. That line is like a fish hook in my stomach that I yank every time I say that line, because I think about how, as I was growing up as a white boy in Boston, every time people spoke about race or racism, the assumption was this is a conversation that was happening for other people, about somewhere else.
Right.
That it wasn't somehow supposed to include me. Because if it did include me, it would make me feel uncomfortable. But comfort and safety are not the same things. I have to now, looking back on that story in particular, force myself into uncomfortable conversations and situations in order to, I think, really have a conversation, really listen, really talk, so that we can actually talk about safety for all, because my comfort is not the same as safety. And that's what this book is trying to get us to talk about, to shake that up a little.
But you know, when you mention things like white privilege, it's not, for me, that's just a thing that everyone wants. Like, everyone just wants to have that same privilege. Well, not that you don't get the ticket, because you committed a crime, so you should get the ticket. But the benefit of the doubt to say, okay, this is, I still want you to go home and be safe. Here's your ticket.
Yes.
To be accountable to that. I've known Brittany for a long time, and I've never heard that story before. And it's kind of, it's making me. So I'll share a story. I'm not sure if I ever told you. So I'm coming home from, which is, why this book resonated with me somewhat, and maybe folks have experienced this or not. But I'm coming home from Williams College, and it's my senior fall, and it's our winter break. And I get off the bus, and I get to my neighborhood, and I grew up in a projects in the Bronx, so I'm there, and I'm visiting a friend. It's about 5:30 in the afternoon. We're about to go watch Sports Center, so we go to his house, and he lives in a 3-story project building, and so his mom is having some kind of get together or what have you, and she's like, I want you guys to wait outside until we're done, and then you can come inside the house and watch Sports Center. All right, cool. So we're sitting in the stairwell waiting for his family to be done with whatever their gathering is, and in that moment, we're sitting talking about whatever, basketball or whatever it is, and in that moment, the police come through. They come from the roof, and we heard rocks moving on the roof. We didn't know what it was, but they come through the roof, and some come from from the lobby. They have their guns drawn, and they draw on me and my friends. So obviously we're kind of shocked and stunned and like, what's going on. They throw us against the wall, and they're kind of searching us, and they're shouting these things that we don't quite understand. We know you were. So apparently, I found out later that in our neighborhood there were a rash of robberies. They were ordering food, and then robbing the delivery folks. And I guess they were doing a stakeout on this building and assumed that we were those people. So I had like huge Jenko cargo pants on, and got a lot of pockets, and so they're patting me down. You don't have any drugs or anything on you. And I'm like, I don't have any drugs, sir. Right. And hopefully you don't find any. Like, don't put some in my pocket. Like, I don't have any drugs. So we get handcuffed, and so in my neighborhood, my parents were well respected. I knew a lot of folks in the neighborhood, and I was one of those people who got out. Do you know what I mean? And so there's like 4 or 5 police cars there. Everyone in the neighborhood is out. They see me walking out in handcuffs, and they're like, "Whoa, what's going on? What's happening?" And I'm like, I didn't do anything, what have you. So I'm dealing with this, and I'm thinking to myself, why is this happening? We're in the back of the squad car, and there's a police officer, a Latina police officer, who puts the windows down. We don't have our jackets on because they're inside the house. And she's speeding, and we have there's a precinct, with a jail in our neighborhood. So she's speeding through the streets, and she's just angry at us. I hate you, perps. You're ruining our neighborhoods. I can't. And so now I'm with 4 people, right? Well, there's 2 of us in the school, and all 4 of us are in college. I hate you, perps. I can't believe what you're doing in our neighborhood. And we're sitting in the back, and we're not saying anything because we know better than saying anything. Right. And so I'm just thinking to myself, how did I get in this situation? So we go through the whole process of they do digital fingerprints. They send them to Albany because Albany is the place that houses, the fingerprint system to see if we have any warrants or what have you. We don't. And so in the precinct, they take your shoelaces and your belt. You're going to jail, and then they start interrogating you. So they're putting all these pictures out. Who are these people? Who are these people? Who's that? And I'm like, sir, I just came back from college. I don't know these people. I don't know what's going on here. They take my wallet out and they pull out my Williams ID, and I happen to have my choke ID in there as well. So I guess one of the officers knew Williams College, and so then they start using racial epithets, right? Oh, you think you're a smart man. Oh, you just think you're so smart. And I'm just sitting there biting the inside of my cheek. So that whole thing ends, I don't know anything. I go, now this is where my own privilege of having gone to Choate and Williams College comes into play, and also having been educated in these places and knowing a little bit about the law. I have a public defender, right, because I can't afford a lawyer. So I have a public defender. I tell him my story, what's going on. And so the charge was criminal mischief and trespassing, because they said we were on the roof of this apartment building, which we weren't. In fact, the funny thing is, my friend lives on the second floor. You have to go to the third floor and then the roof. Right. So that's interesting. Right. And so I tell him the story, like what we were doing, and the public defender goes, listen, you gotta cop a plea. There's nothing we can do for you. So I look at my public defender and I say, what happened to the defending part? Right. And so I say I want a new lawyer, but I know I could do that. Right. Got a new public defender, told my case, whatever, we get into court. The prosecutor's trying to give me 1,000 hours of community service. Again, I'm in my head like, this is unreal. Trying to give me 1,000 hours of community service. I don't know if she's trying to make her bones or what have you. And so this is exactly what happens. My lawyer is speaking, and so the judge goes like this. I see him looking at my file. My eyes are somewhat welling up because I don't know what's going to happen. I see him looking at my file, and he goes, oh, just like that. Oh, Choate Rosemary Hall, Williams, dismissed. So I walked out. I was like, okay, I appreciate that, but that's crazy. Exactly. Like that should have no bearing in general on my 3 friends got 1,000 hours community service. And we didn't have the same lawyer. Right. He went in different times than I did. They got 1,000 hours community service. So definitely never shared that in a public forum like this. That's amazing. But you made me think of that, and it's that experience which is why this book resonated with me, which is why I'm so invested in having these conversations with kids, regardless of where they kind of land on the issue, because I think those stories, and you're talking about listening, those stories are really important, and those stories are many. Yeah. And where I grew up.
And as I'm hearing you tell the story, I'm thinking about one of the moments in that when you're talking about the public defender, because it makes me again think that if I'm listening to the story, but I listen to it in context of like the larger system, right? How many times does the public defender just tell somebody, just take the plea, right? And that's not
go to jail.
And go to jail. Yeah,
right. Absolutely.
The German edition of All American Boys, there's an edition in German, but the title in German is "It's Not Okay," which I find fascinating, because I think that while the American title is addressing Americans, hello Americans, the German title is talking about a sort of systemic understanding, which is, this is not okay. We can't have the conversation without first saying these kinds of moments of violence, or these kinds of time and time again, these kinds of assumptions like just take the plea, go to jail. That's not okay. Right. We can do better. We're supposed to do better.
So, there's a lot of tension in many ways going, with things like the Black Lives Matter movement, Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, and I can see all the different sides and understand all the different perspectives on those issues. But I'm interested in your perspective on that whole thing that's going on and continues to go on in our country.
So this is something that comes up often when we're speaking at schools. Well, truthfully, this question comes up more often when we're in schools that are predominantly white. Honest truth, more often than not. The question comes up, and I have to do a good job not sort of having my own knee-jerk reaction, right, and thinking about the context of the community. I'll share this one anecdote. One of the reasons why we were asked we were invited to speak in St. Anne, Missouri, which is right next to Ferguson, Missouri. We were invited to speak, and then 5 minutes before we went on stage, the principal said, "Don't talk about your book." And literally 5 minutes before we went on stage, And so we had to like quickly we were like, so what do we do now? We'll talk about literacy and like, literacy is great, read. And it was in a gym, and I was like throwing the microphone through the basketball net, and I was like, do your drills, everybody. It was like ridiculous. It was so stupid. But the reason why we were asked not to speak about the book was because the principal said there are too many folks in the audience whose parents are police officers, and this is St. Anne, Missouri, right next to Ferguson, and you can imagine that tensions are really, 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 really tight.
I can definitely understand that, sure.
And thinking about that, so I get that. Like, there's no reason to step into a situation and make things worse or more contentious in a community. And I also want to say that if we continue to protect those who are already protected, we are perpetuating a status quo that disenfranchises other people. So, when we say all lives matter, or we say blue lives matter, what we're doing is, in effect, protecting people who already have protection. When I tell my story about not getting a ticket, that's a story about my life mattering. Because a person is saying, I pity you in that moment, you made a mistake, but go home, be safe. The reason why we have to say Black Lives Matter is because every time I'm on stage with Jason and he's sharing his stories about being pulled over by the police, you can tell right away, by the way that the story is told and what happens in the story, the disrespect for his own body in the story is one where his life doesn't matter. And what that sounds maybe more dramatic than you want to hear, but I think it is only fair to speak that truth. It's impossible for me not to say when I'm behind a microphone, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. Get on board with Ben and Jerry, they just said it. It's really important for us to think about how to contextualize this conversation. It's not Black Lives Matter more than, it's not Black Lives Matter first and foremost. It's an essential calling to say if we don't say it, we're going to perpetuate the same narrative we perpetuated in this country for 400 years.
So why can't saying all lives matter encompass that as well?
Because because all lives matter is not recognizing. Oh, here's an example. Have you ever seen that cartoon? Maybe some of you have seen this cartoon. The cartoon where there are two boys who are looking out over a wall, and one boy is tall enough and he can see straight out over the wall. The other boy is standing on a box because he's shorter, so he's standing on a box so he can see out over the wall. The reason why I think it's important to say Black Lives Matter and not all lives matter is that the goal is, yes, all people should see over the wall. Absolutely. If we don't believe that, if we don't already believe that, we have some serious questions to ask ourselves about whether or not, that's a whole different ethical question, if you don't believe people's lives matter. The reason we have to say Black Lives Matter is to provide that box, right? This is the conversation about equity versus equality. We should all believe that all lives matter, that all people are equal, right? But in order for us to have equity in society, in order for us to have a more equitable and functioning society where people have the same rights and live with the same safety in their bodies every day, we need to provide the box. We need to say Black Lives Matter, to prioritize that we're saying this as opposed to ignoring it. So all lives matter in my mind, especially as a white person, I have to be comfortable saying Black Lives Matter. Because if I can't say Black Lives Matter as a white person, I have to do some serious work looking in the mirror. That should be easy to come off the tongue, for me.
Yeah, part of it is, like I said, the conversations that I've had with kids who talk about all lives matter, and you can obviously feel free to chime in. I think this still the rub in terms of saying all lives matter or blue lives matter is this recognition that I'll say the blue lives matter, that police officers don't, the feeling that they don't get the respect that they deserve. Or Mr. Jones. Yeah.
Go back to something that you said about the St. Anne.
Yeah.
Where they said that they would prefer that you did make more uncomfortable. And if the situation isn't made more uncomfortable, it won't change.
Right.
And so, and I'm looking at this more from a historical point of view, is with the majority being comfortable and having been comfortable for an awful long time in this country,
Yeah.
if they're not made to feel uncomfortable, what's the motivation to change? Goodness?
Right.
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 I mean, that would be really nice.
Right.
But I think it's a little idealistic to say that goodness is going to prevail when history and the present time says that it hasn't. And so isn't there a necessity to make situations more uncomfortable by communication as opposed to more uncomfortable by violence or other means?
I agree 100%. 100%. I think it's necessary to become, for those who have felt comfortable for most of their lives, it's necessary for us to be made to feel uncomfortable in order for us to actually begin to change things.
It would be great if we felt uncomfortable on our own.
Right.
That's hard.
It's hard to just choose it without being made to feel uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah. Agreed. And so that's why having talks like this, or I would argue that's what there was a line of graffiti that I saw on a wall that said the role of the artist is to make revolution irresistible, and I think it's actually quoting a poet whose name escapes me right now, but the role of some art can be to do that very thing that you're talking about, which is to force folks to feel uncomfortable when otherwise life is made to protect them and feel comfortable. So I agree 100%. It's a good thing to be made to feel uncomfortable. And so just so it's clear, I need that as well. Like I'm standing up, or now I'm sitting, but I'm sitting up here speaking in front of you, and I'm saying all these things, but that doesn't mean that I've like somehow taken myself out of, I can't take myself out of my white body. I will forever be the white man that I am. And I can't pretend to have escaped that myself. So I too need to be forced and made to feel uncomfortable, as often as possible, in order, I think, for me to have a better understanding of what it means to be uncomfortable every day. Because I will add that when Jason and I are touring around the country together, Jason is a very, very tall, large black man with dreads. Long dreads. When we walk into a restaurant together, when we walk into a bank together, when we walk into many, many, many spaces, it is amazing to me, and I have to say, maybe for the first time in my life, to be side by side with someone and to watch people's eyes looking at us, and to watch how people's eyes shift and how they are uncomfortable by him walking into the space. That makes him feel uncomfortable. And for the first time in my life, I'm 39 years old. I'm uncomfortable in that moment, but not in the same way. I'm uncomfortable thinking about, why is this all uncomfortable? Right. We're just walking in to get some money out of the bank, but it's there. So I think we need to be more conscious and be made to feel uncomfortable, as you're suggesting, 100%. That's a great comment.
Thank you. John?
I just had a question. I mean, you were talking about any sane person, has the idea that all lives matter.
Can you speak up a little bit?
So when Stop and Frisk came to a close last year on June 3rd, within 5 months, murder rates were like 19.5% in New York City.
So you said, I'm gonna say that last week.
Yeah.
When Stop and Frisk did what?
When Stop and Frisk came to a close, in 5
Came
months,
to a close.
Yeah, murder rates were up 19.5% in New York City alone. That's, according to the city of New York. Also in 2013, this is according to the FBI, there were almost 2,500 homicides that involved black African Americans. None of those 2,500 homicides, 2,300 were committed by black African Americans themselves. So I just have a question for you. Don't you think there's a larger issue at hand with, the corruption and everything else that's happening within the inner cities? We should address that. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is a tragedy, but don't you think there's a larger underlying issue here?
So what's the underlying issue that you're getting at?
Basically, the education, everything else that is involved with the artist abuse.
Right. So part of what I appreciate your question. Thank you. The trick for me when thinking about this, right, is that I don't have access right now to all the statistics, right? So it's. I just want to be clear that as I begin to speak, I don't have access to all the statistics. So forgive me for that. I believe it's important to think about what presumptions are at work within us when we are searching for statistics to prove our hypothesis, right? Because if the hypothesis to begin with is that there are neighborhoods that are problematic, there are people who are problematic, right? And we find statistics to prove that, then okay, that's okay, but I would still challenge the original hypothesis. I think that maybe there's a lot of other things that can be done, and I don't think stop and frisk is a useful way to police a city. Despite that statistic that you mentioned, I don't know, for example, how many guns were confiscated in the number of instances of stop and frisk, right? So is it worth the disrespect and the dehumanizing of entire swaths of the city, right? Is it worth that to improve that one statistic? Of course that statistic needs to be improved, right? Of course. But I'm not sure that the tactic of stop and frisk is actually the one at work there are a lot of other factors with economics in the city, with tons of other things, right? And again, the challenge is the hypothesis. What if instead the hypothesis is that there aren't problematic sectors of the city, there aren't problematic people in the city, but instead that our city itself is failing the people within it? Then I begin to really have a problem with stop and frisk even more, because why does it always happen to the black kids coming into my class and none of the white kids, who, by the way, have marijuana in their backpack in school, right? That's totally imbalanced injustice. And that should be challenged. I don't have any statistics for how many of those white kids have marijuana in their backpack because nobody stopped and frisked them. Right? So the original hypothesis is what I need to challenge in that statement, because I want the city to work for everybody, not statistics to prove that we have to over-police a particular sector of the city.
That was my other question. Basically, was obviously the police brutality is most immediate, but you won't see the corruption, everything else that happens within these neighborhoods. That doesn't get any attention by the media. Why do you think that is?
What? Say that again. What does the corruption in terms of what?
Corruption, but the idea that they allow these things to happen in the cities. That like I said, there's out of the 2,500 black homicides that happened, that was from 2013. 2,300 of them were committed by other African Americans or citizens of color. And I was just wondering why that doesn't get as much attention as say the minor incident. Actually not minor, but like the smaller number.
Right.
That this happens.
So is your question, why in the media do they not show that there's a lot of black on black crime?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying I think there's more of that than there is of white on black crime. And I'm just wondering, we should address it. It seems like it's a larger issue. Don't get me wrong, these are tragedies, but I just think there's a larger issue at hand. It doesn't get any attention at all.
So what's interesting, as I think about that question is, again, going back to the hypothesis, I think it's interesting that the fact that black on black crime is a statement or a narrative is interesting, right? Because we never talk about white on white crime or Latino crime. And so when you look at the statistics of interracial crime, right? Because we're so segmented and segregated, anytime there are crimes, it's going to be interracial. So if you look at the FBI reports on white crime, 89% of crimes on white. So, but the fact that black on black crime is a narrative is something to kind of examine. Because I never hear white on white crime or, again, Latino on Latino crime, but you hear that kind of black on black crime thing. So I think that's an interesting thing to kind of look at also as I was thinking about your question. Good question.
I think there's some other questions too.
Good question. Okay.
Sorry.
You're good? Yeah.
I just wanted to know what your idea and what your thoughts were on the recent assault on a police officer who didn't want to defend herself because she feared community backlash.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's unfortunate that we're in the situation that we're in, right? Because the fact of the matter is, when people are being held accountable for the first time in ways that they haven't been held accountable before, right? It's that uncomfortable space that we were talking about before. And so necessarily there are going to be some shifts, right? There are going to be moments where police officers feel nervous, they're not sure how to act. Yes, these are things that are going to happen. I also think it's systemically true, the big picture, right? So that is an incident, and I you know, it's for every individual in all of these moments, we feel sorry for them because it's terrible, right? But for the system at large, I mean, the police chief in Wellesley, Massachusetts, who is the head of the International Police Chiefs Association, earlier this week, I forget if it was Monday or Tuesday, just put out a statement, right, for the entire International Association of Police Chiefs that says, essentially, we apologize. We have failed communities of color in this country for decades, and we can no longer do so. That's an amazing statement for him to have made, because it begins to address the years and 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 years of failing of a particular community, right? So I do believe that these moments are tragic and horrific, but again, if I want to talk about the system, which is what I want us to talk about, how do we address the system so that everybody can see over the wall, so everybody has the same view, right? We're not going to say, well, sorry, you're short. Forget it. No, we want to make it so everybody can see over the wall, right? So we've got to address the system at large, and we're working on that. And I really applaud the police who have done. Last year, President Obama made a speech in front of the Police Chiefs Association in Chicago, and he made many points about how we need to address and make these changes. Since that speech, there have been systemic changes. It's happening. It's a good thing. Police officers that we've spoken to while on tour, I mean, we were in Boonesboro, Maryland, which is amazing that we were really, really basically like on the edge of the mountains. We were pretty far away from the quote-unquote urban inner city, right? There were police officers who came up to us and hugged us and cried because they said, we're so glad that we're able to have this conversation with the students in our school. These are police officers in the community. Meanwhile, there also were police officers outside the school because they weren't sure what was going to happen, right? But I think that really speaks to the fact that people are trying to fix the system. So when I hear about these isolated incidents, it's the same thing I was saying before about when we say Darren Wilson was an exception, when we murdering Michael Brown, when we say the death of Eric Gardner by chokehold was an exception. If we keep making all of these exceptions, we're not addressing the system. And so that's why I keep trying to talk about the system at large.
I'd just like to hear your thoughts about the national anthem debate, and I think there's a lot of conflating that if you're kneeling, that you're against the American military and you're not patriotic.
Right. I'm laughing because we get this question all the time as well, and it really it's unfortunate. In the novel, Quinn, his father is a soldier who died in Afghanistan, and Quinn is grappling with what principles did he die for. And I think about this. I have law enforcement in my family. I have folks who work for the government at large in my family. I come from a huge Irish Catholic family. I have a family doing everything. But taking a knee during the national anthem to ask us to review the principles that our country stands for is precisely the democratic principles that we are afforded by those who are fighting for us, right? They're fighting for us to have that opportunity. They're not fighting for us to remain quiet. They're not fighting for us to align ourselves without public debate, right? That would be them fighting for, Stalinism. They're not fighting for that. They're fighting for democracy. They're fighting for what we have. Let's use what we have to better ourselves. Colin Kaepernick taking a knee is a patriotic act. It's an act that says, please review our society, because we can. What a privilege we have that we can do that. I totally applaud that. And by the way, you can also see the photos. How come it's the case that everyone's talking about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, but all the people in the photo booth right beside him never stand, never put their hands on their hearts. They're never, it's like, come on. So I like to speak about that because I think it's important to recognize patriotism where it exists. We called the people in Boston, Massachusetts, patriots for congregating, in the South Boston Church to speak against the tyranny of the British government. They put free assembly and free speech into the Constitution because they needed to do that to escape tyranny. Colin Kaepernick is expressing those principles. He's a patriot. I'm just getting fired up.
Going on the previous question, after Colin Kaepernick went with the Warner fixing the system, do you think the media helps or hinders fixing the system in our communities?
So, I want to answer as honestly as possible. So when you say, do you think the media helps or hinders, can you just explain that a little bit more to me? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I watch the news sometimes,
Nice one.
But we were talking about this in United Students, which is our social justice group on campus.
Yeah.
How the media is biased, depending on which side of the coin you want to look at. And I was wondering if you think it helps, like it get the word out and inspire people that, all Black lives matter, or do you think it like turns the tides and, makes people, not like police officers feel like maybe.
So I was at, I'm going to answer this in a long way, but I was at a civil rights conference at the beginning of the summer, and somebody asked a question to a panel, and the panel member who responded was basically in charge of in charge of elections in the state of Massachusetts, and I forget what his title is. That's why I'm blanking on that right now. But somebody asked him about the rhetoric in the political campaigns, if that is making America worse, because we're hearing this rhetoric over and over again. It's as many hear it, hate speech. And his response, and this is a black man answering this question. His response was, "No, I do not think that it is making things worse. I think it is making us more aware of what exists already." And so, while I do believe that as I was saying before, I think there's something that we could do better than the point counterpoint kind of news where people are just shouting at each other. I also think that with all this media, all this stuff, right? If we didn't have social media showing us these videos over the last 2 years, I don't know we would have the Black Lives Matter movement. And if we didn't have the Black Lives Matter movement, we wouldn't have what I consider this really powerful civil rights movement that is happening right now. And so I think it goes both ways, right? It can fuel the fire, and it can show us what's really out there.
But I was gonna say, I think I think in many respects, and it's definitely not perfect by any means.
No.
But I think that the kind of the revolution that's happened on social media is really challenging what's happening on TV or in newspapers, etc. Because I think that I think we're in terms of corruption. I think John brought up corruption. I think that we are oftentimes corrupted by sensationalism, by money, by how do we get the headlines, who's going to click on this. And so I think that when you read certain headlines, there is a kind of provocative nature to them that doesn't necessarily help the conversation, in my opinion. And I think that it can oftentimes ruin discourse because people sometimes just solely glom on to a statistic or a headline on both sides and say, this has to be true, this is what it is, instead of having this conversation and trying to understand each other's points. But then again, recognizing some factual things that are actually true, and then how do we actually address those things? So I'm cognizant of the time, because many of you have class in about 5 minutes, and it's challenging to go back into academic mode, right? AP, whatever it is you're taking, honors this, pre-calc that, right? And so I want to make sure I give you a little bit of time to breathe a little bit, digest some of the things that we've spoken about. I welcome any and all of you to come talk to me, talk to your advisors about this conversation. You can feel free to stick around if you want to continue to talk with us. But I want to give you that chance, and obviously teachers and faculty as well. So thank you very much, Brendan.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for listening.